And welcome once again to EWTN's Bookmark. I'm Doug Keck, your host. Our author is Dr. Edward Sri, author of Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, Practical Insights from John Paul II's Love and Responsibility, which is published by Servant Publications. Well, welcome, Ted. It's great to have you here. I always think of you as Ted as opposed to Edward. But, and many of our audience has seen you many times on EWTN over the years. You've done a couple of series for us, and in fact, you've just taped a mini-series that's actually on this particular same topic, right?
I just did, yes.
Okay, and also we can mention as well, you've got another book that's also out too called A Biblical Walk Through the Mass as well, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay, so you're keeping busy. Now, what's your day job when you're not writing books and doing TV shows?
Sure, my day job, I work with the Augustine Institute. Okay. It's a graduate program in the Archdiocese of Denver. Okay. We are in about 5 years, we have become the 6th largest master's program doing training for people in lay ecclesial ministry. So we have an on-campus program gathering people from all around the country, and a video distance education program that is attracting people from all over the world.
Now, you use the expression lay ecclesial ministry. Now, a few years back, more conservative Catholics would have been concerned about that expression. Explain what that means.
Well, I'm just using the term simply that we've seen other people use to describe where we would stand in the church in terms of the amount of students that we have for our particular program. Okay. I think if I had to articulate, I would say we do get a lot of religious and priests and deacons in our program, but the strongest group, the largest group of our students consists of lay people that are wanting to do apostolic work in the church, whether it's campus ministry, teaching at a Catholic school, diocesan or parish catechetics. And that's a term that the U.S. Bishops' Conference is using to describe that lay ecclesial
and certainly
ministry.
That's what people working here at EWTN as well, as a lay apostolate. Now, the other thing is, who else, what is it, Tim Gray? What other names might people know would be associated with that same organization?
Oh, well, I've got a great team of teachers. So Tim Gray, who's also done a number of series here. Jeff Cavins, who's also been a big presence at EWTN. He comes in and teaches some intensive classes in our distance ed program. Curtis Martin also
from Focus
teaches some classes.
And also from Crossing the Goal. A lot of people know him from
exactly.
Too, right?
I think some people might, on your viewership, might know a name by the name of Scott Hahn, maybe.
Sure, yes.
He comes in sometimes and teaches some classes.
He's not as popular as you are, Ted.
Oh,
but people are familiar with him, right?
We all studied with Dr. Hahn many years ago. So it's great that our students get a chance to study with some of the best dynamic teachers that are really a part of the new evangelization.
Okay, so you're teaching, you're doing this. Is writing normally a part of teaching? I know a lot of in college programs, professors are supposed to write books. Are you supposed to write books, or are you driven to write books?
I think it's certainly encouraged at our institute. We want to keep people engaged in the academic life, and writing books is a key part of that. At the same time, if I didn't have anything like that at my school, I am driven to do this. My background was actually journalism. That was my first degree. Okay. I worked in the corporate world in communications, and I've always loved writing. And so once I began teaching theology, it's just a great joy for me to try to take the complex teachings of the church, of Christian tradition, and make them really accessible and understandable for the average lay person. Right.
Now, in talking about this particular book, which dovetails into your miniseries as well, it's interesting because you're talking here about love and responsibility. Now, that's a work by the late, great John Paul II, recently beatified. That's a work you kind of hear, but you hear more theology of the body. Now, are these the same things, or are they different?
I like to say that love and responsibility is the key essential background to theology of the body. Today, there's so much excitement and enthusiasm, especially among young people, about theology of the body. But they're going to really understand theology of the body well, they need to understand love and responsibility. It's almost like theology of the body is the New Testament, and love and responsibility is the Old Testament, in this sense, that to really understand the New Testament, you got to understand what came before. And I remember when I was preparing to teach a theology of the body class for the first time for university students, I spent my winter break just going back and reading Love and Responsibility. And that's when I became so moved by what JP2 was teaching there. I remember being in this crypt of this Benedictine Abbey in Atchison, Kansas. And I was down there every day, and I would read maybe 10 to 12 pages in an hour. Partly because it's thick, it's dense, but even more so because I was just so moved about what John Paul II was saying about this is what love is, this is what is going on in the dynamics between men and women. For me, personally, it was like a marriage examination of conscience. I was reading this going, oh my goodness, here's what love is. And I know I'm not living it out as much. And I also saw that there was a lot of practical insight for the young people I was teaching in terms of their friendships with the opposite sex, dating, courtship relationships, engagement, that it was going to be so immediately practical to help them navigate all those murky waters about relationships with the opposite sex.
Well, it struck me right in the beginning, acknowledge you say, I'm grateful to the many young adults and married couples. That makes sense. And then you say, and religious who have explored John Paul II's love and responsibility with me in recent years. And of course, men, women in mystery of love. You know, sometimes people try to figure out, you're talking about relationships, etc. How do the religious fit into this?
Well, it's interesting. I've had the chance to give retreats to priests, to nuns, deacons, so many different kinds of settings like this, where they wanted me to teach on this, partly because they want to understand the church's teaching on marriage and family to pass it on to the people that they're serving. But there was one religious group, the Missionaries of Charity, that had me come out and wanted me to teach on love and responsibility and about the love between a husband and wife. And I remember this particular sister saying, and Ted, we want you to be very explicit about what John Paul II is teaching about these things, about what really goes on in a relationship between a man and woman, because we view ourselves as a spouse of Jesus Christ. And so we need to understand what that spousal relationship is really like. And the more we learn about that on a human level, that will shed light on our relationship with Jesus. And it has been a great experience for me to learn how to apply these beautiful teachings in the life of a priest or the life of a religious sister.
Right, I know in the old days when I was involved with Marriage Encounter, and a priest would be on the weekend, people would say, well, why is there a priest there? And they used to talk about the priest's relationship with his people, in a sense the way a married couple relates to one another. The priest relates to his parish and to his people as well. At the part here in the beginning as well, you say, my deepest gratitude is for my wife Elizabeth for her loving support throughout this project, the way she strives to live love and responsibility in our own marriage. I guess I got two questions. You always don't reach the goal, you always have to strive. And do you strive as well? And would she say so?
This is, when I go out all across the country speaking to young people on love and responsibility and also married couples. Those are the two main groups I'm working with. And every time I'm standing up there, I always say, please pray for me. Please pray for me and my wife, that we may live out what we're teaching. It's easy to stand up and talk about these things. They're exciting, they're interesting. It's a whole other game to try to live it out. And yet I know that's what I need prayers for the most. And the good thing is, and I tell other couples this, when we see the beauty of what God's plan is for love and for marriage, we're also going to see how far short we are from living that out. But the good news is that God's grace and His mercy is with us, and He wants to heal our selfish hearts and transform them so that we can grow in love and responsibility. So that evermore it's really Christ working through the husband and through the wife to love each other and to love their children. And so that we can really have tremendous trust in God's grace, in the sacrament of reconciliation, the sacrament of the Eucharist, to help the Holy Spirit to work through our hearts more. And that's what I know, that's what I need to rely on the most. I love this stuff, but I know I'm not living it out as well as I need to.
Right. Right at the beginning, this struck me because this is dangerous. Don't let my wife see this. And you talk about brilliantly sheds light on the mysterious dynamics between men and women. That sometimes seems to be the case. And certainly they used to talk about a Marriage Encounter kind of like guys who didn't want to rock the boat. And sometimes you read these things and you say, I can't live up to this. Why should I go down this path so I can be reminded of how bad I'm actually doing? What do you say to people?
Well, that quote that you just read was from a friend of mine I was showing him quotes from Love and Responsibility, and that's what he said. He said, whoa, Ted, this book is dangerous. Don't let my wife see this, because he knew he was going to be so challenged. But at the same time, he meant that tongue in cheek. It's very important for us to know, okay, we may not be living it out, but I need to know what the goal is. If I don't have a goal, I'm just going to meander in my life, meander in my marriage, and I'm not going to have as good of a marriage as God will want me to have. And so I think it's so important to always say, okay, this is what God is calling us to, and then how can I incrementally get closer to that?
Now also, you talk about all different topics that he talks about here, and one of the things, and later on you actually have like reflection questions right at the end of the chapter. And when I started to read the book, first thing I thought is, do you have to have read Love and Responsibility? Do you read it along with? So it's kind of, you can do it either way, right?
Yeah, this book I think stands on its own. What I'm trying to do is just take the complex, challenging teachings of John Paul II, which are really hard to read for the average layperson, break them down, make them very accessible. I know people in junior high and high school that are using this book in their classroom with those high school kids. I know a lot of college students have been reading it, a lot of young adults. So it's written at a very low level to make it very accessible for the average person. But at the same time, it's taking the depth of the teaching and transferring it to the practicalities of day-to-day life. There's question and answers at the end, so that it could be used for small groups. I know a lot of people are using it like a Bible study or a book study, and that's what it's meant to serve, is if people want to do that. But a lot of people just read it on their own as a guide to help them through Love and Responsibility. I've had many people tell me, even just this last weekend, I was at a big conference, and some people came up and said, I've been trying to read Love and Responsibility for the last year, and it is so hard. And then I read your book, and it opened up the whole book for me. Now I have a framework and can go study Love and Responsibility on my own. And then at the same time, I have the people that just, oh, I loved your book, and it's so helpful for me, and they don't actually necessarily go back to Love and Responsibility. And I quote a Love and Responsibility all over the place in this book, so they get the meaty quotes, the key points that JP2 is making throughout the book.
Right, and it kind of covers friendship, attraction, relationships, men and women, that there are differences. I didn't realize that. Society doesn't seem to think so. Love, the two aspects of love, etc., emotions, sexuality, marriage, and chastity. Let me ask you up front, in researching and writing this book, were you surprised at anything you picked up that you missed the first time you read the book?
Oh, that's what happened. You know, I had come across Love and Responsibility during my graduate studies. And then later in life, having done a lot of ministry with college students and having been married, I was preparing for that theology of the body class, and then I said I want to go back and look at Love and Responsibility again, and it was completely eye-opening. So much in there. I would say a couple of things. First of all, just when he writes about the dynamics between a man and a woman, what's really going on in an attraction. So boy meets girl, there's that initial spark of attraction, what's happening? And I don't know anyone else that just really gets right down and explains what's happening in an attraction. He talks about how men and women are attracted to each other in two main ways. We all think of course, the physical attraction. We're attracted to the physical features, the good looks of the other person. But John Paul II spends a lot of time also talking about how we also have an emotional attraction, sentimentality, an attraction to the other person's psychological qualities, he says, what he defines as the masculinity of the man, the femininity of the woman. So the mystery of the opposite sex we're also attracted to. So there's this physical attraction as well as an emotional attraction. And that's so important to understand the difference between those two attractions and the ways that we could then use people. And he spends a lot of time writing about how, well, we could use people physically, and I think a lot of people in the Catholic world get that. You know, that through sexual acts we could use
you talk
another
about
person.
that whole utilitarianism, really.
Exactly.
Which is very popular in today's culture.
Yeah, where you reduce the other person just to a body for my own enjoyment. And I think, again, a lot of Catholics get that. But you don't hear a lot of Catholics talk about this other aspect where we could use people, and that is emotionally. You know, we've had a plethora of chastity speakers over the last 20 years, which has been wonderful for our church and for young people. But they tend to focus a lot on the physical actions. But we can just as well use people emotionally, where I might be attracted to somebody and I like being with them and I get a rush of good feelings from being with them, but I'm not really committed to them as a person. I'm not really committed in seeking out what's really good for them. I'm more in the relationship because I get this powerful rush of good feelings. And that also is equally dangerous in terms of falling into a kind of use of the other person.
Well, let me ask you, if a friend asks you on Tuesday night whether you're free on Friday night, what do you say?
That's a question that I ask in my book about how when you treat other persons. You know, even good devout Christians often will treat people somewhat in a utilitarian way. And so the example I use is how I often ask my college students or young adults at a Theology on Tap group gathering, you know, if you're free on Friday night and your friend asks you on Tuesday, would you like to go to a movie, and it's a movie you want to see, what do you typically say? And the average young person doesn't say, yes, I'll go, or no. They typically say, well, let me get back to you, or I'll wait and see. And I asked them, well, why didn't you say yes if you're free and this is your friend, you want to? Well, I guess I wanted to see what else happens. You know, if there's another option, another party, or another opportunity. I don't want to commit too early on Tuesday, you know, because another opportunity may come up that might be more fun for me on Friday night. And I mentioned this to the young people, and they'll go, oh yeah, we do this. And what we're really doing there is saying, oh, my dear friend, I don't want to say yes right now, but I don't want to say no either to you, because, well, what if nothing else comes up on Friday night? I don't want to be home alone as a loser on Friday night, so I want to keep you, my dear friend, as a backup.
Right.
And you see, and we use each other that way. Now, what's interesting is I've used this example with the married couples, people in their 30s and 40s and 50s and 60s, and I say, this is what happens with the young people, and a lot of those adults go, we do that too.
Right.
We do that with our own peers, you know. So this is a way that utilitarianism has really soaked deep into the hearts of so many modern Americans.
Well, what if somebody said, well, you know, I like that person and not the most exciting person to spend time with, but I don't want to hurt their feelings. So I'm just being kind.
Well, that's a different thing. You know, at that point, you know, I don't think that that's what many of the young adults are doing. Okay. You know, and they've admitted it. Now, sometimes maybe they're saying that, but in most cases, they really just want to keep their options open.
Right. But is that also a function of the whole problem with commitment for young people today?
Yeah, a commitment for young people. Yeah, I just don't want to commit right now because I always want to keep the options open for what's going to be best for me, as opposed to thinking about just the good of the other person, the good of our friendship.
Right. What makes or breaks a relationship?
Okay. I think in terms of a relationship between man and woman, a romantic relationship that's moving toward authentic love, I think this is where JP, to another great insight, he gets into what is authentic love. And he talks about objective love, love that is existing in reality, and subjective love, love that's just my own experience. And he says that when I'm focused on the physical attraction I have towards someone else, or that emotional attraction, when I'm always looking inside and asking, you know, what do I get out of this relationship? Is it fun for me? Do I have the strong feelings there? You know, like, and if the feelings are there, then I know that I'm in love. But if, you know, you've lost that loving feeling, then whoa, the relationship is over. You know, if that's the kind of approach I have, that's a sign that I'm not really in love with this other person. That's not really love. If I'm constantly looking in, engaging my feelings, John Paul II says that's not fullness of love. He says that's, quote, just a psychological experience. I'm just reacting to the other person's physical good looks and the pleasure I get from looking at them. Or I'm reacting to the powerful rush of emotions I get from the person. I'm not committed to the person, I'm just committed to the good feelings and the pleasure I derive from that person, the fun times I have with that person. Real love, he says, love in reality, what really exists between two people in love, involves two things. One, he calls it self-giving, and the other thing he calls it responsibility. What are those two things? So for John Paul II, you know, he uses this phrase, self-giving, in so many of his writings, and we as Catholics have become familiar with that now. Right. But what does it really mean? Love and responsibility, I think, gives one of the best definitions of self-giving.
We hear self-donation a lot, I remember.
Self-donation, self-gift, all this kind of language. What does that really mean? Do I wrap myself up in a present, put a bow on, and say, hi, I'm your gift?
Well, I think a lot of people today in society get the self part. It's the donating and giving part they're not so big on.
But what are we actually giving? And John Paul II, in Love and Responsibility, he notes how what makes every person unique is that we all have our own intellect, we all have our own will. So I have my own power of self-determination, autonomy. I could choose what I want to do with my life. And yet, in self-giving, love impels me to give up my freedom, he says, to limit my freedom so that I may surrender my life, in a way, my will in a sense, and commit my will to this other person and seek their good. So while I could do anything in my life, I freely choose not to always just do whatever I want, and commit my will to this one other person, to her good, to the good of our marriage and the good of our children. You know, it reminds me of...
it sounds like sacrifice.
It's all
people aren't too big on that today.
Sacrificial love. You know, a friend of mine who's also been an EWTN father, Stuart Swetland, you know.
Yeah, sure, very well.
He used to do chaplain work at University of Illinois, and he told me when he would sit down with the college students for marriage preparation, he'd sit them down the first day and say, I know you think you know what marriage is, but you don't. Here's the definition of marriage. Marriage is never getting to do what you want. Again, he does that tongue-in-cheek, but you know there's a truth to that of dying to my own preferences, my own desires, to commit my will to serve someone else. Do you see how that's so different than the subjective aspect of love, where it's, well, I'm just not happy anymore in this relationship, and I don't feel like I'm really coming alive in this relationship anymore. That's so self-centered. John Paul II's understanding is no, it's about I'm committing my will to seek what's best for this other person.
You know, listening to you talk about it, I mean, you can inject the idea of spirituality for some people, the whole emotional aspect, the attraction, the excitement. I'm just not getting the kick out of it I got before, so I've got to look for the new high.
Absolutely, and this is why, again, it's so applicable for the religious and the priests that we talked about earlier. The same thing, if I'm always looking in terms of what I get out of it, that relationship isn't going to last long on a human level and my relationship with God.
This is one of the little titles to one of the paragraphs, Insecurity, Not Love.
Yeah, in so many relationships, when it's focused more on this, on what am I getting out of the relationship, if you and the other person, and you're dating, so to speak, are kind of having that self-centered view, you're going to have a lot of fragile insecurity in a relationship, because those feelings we know can rise and come down, and if you're constantly having to react to where am I at with my feelings, or am I helping the other person have good feelings, I'm totally going to be insecure. Whereas if I am in a relationship where I know the other person is committed to me and seeking out what's best for me as a person, that's what real love is, to will the good of another, the Catechism says, and to want what's best for the other person. If I'm in that kind of relationship, then I have great confidence in the relationship. There's a great security there, because I don't feel like I have to always put on a performance to elicit some reaction, that's going to make that other person happy. But if I'm in that other kind of relationship that's more subjective, more focused on my feelings, my emotions and all, then I feel like I have to constantly keep the other person happy, never bring up tough topics. If it's a difficult topic, I don't feel like you're treating me well, then that's going to make that other person not feel happy or feel like they have strong feelings for me. It's going to rock the boat in the relationship, so I tend not to bring things up. I'm living in a relationship of insecurity.
And then you end up burying those feelings, and they don't die, they end up being buried alive, as we used to say. And they come out in other ways.
They'll come out in other ways, and it's a very messy relationship.
Now, throughout the book, there's a couple of side-by-side charts you put together. One on two sides of love. Is your love mature? Now, is that something you developed from the book?
Basically, it's John Paul II's teachings, and these are basically flowing out. These charts are flowing out of what I put on the board in the classroom.
Right. Okay.
So that I sum up key points and show. Look here. Let's contrast the two kinds of love here. So we got the objective, the subjective. We got the objective looks outward at the other person, seeks their good.
Right.
The subjective is always looking inward and looking at what I get out of the other person. The objective leads to security, to trust, to unconditional love. The subjective leads to great insecurity and fear in the relationship.
Right. And you also have one that also talks about immature love versus mature love. You say in chapter 6, a great marriage is not one that simply stays together, but one in which spouses experience deep personal communion with each other. Sometimes when I see that, I wonder, whether people say, well, gee, I'm happy I'm just staying married these days, and he's looking for me to be in deep communion. Now I feel like I'm failing. You know what I mean? Is this helping me or making me feel like I'm a failure? What do you say?
Sure. I would say, look, staying together is, of course, a very good thing. But that's not the goal for marriage. When you went to the altar on your wedding day, you didn't say, I hope that we're just going to stay together. That's not it, So, for example, Doug, if you and I bumped into each other 10 years from now, and you say, oh, Ted, how's your wife, Elizabeth, how's your marriage going? And I said, oh, it's great. We haven't divorced yet.
Right.
That doesn't mean it's going great. We want a marriage, and this is what God wants for us, and He's put it deep in our hearts, a desire to love and to be loved. He wants a marriage in which husband and wives can look each other in the eye 10, 20, 30 years in their marriage and say, I love you more now today than I did when we were first married. We want to grow in that love, grow in that communion. And again, certainly for couples that struggle and they don't divorce and they stay together, that could be very heroic, and I'm very grateful for that. And I think God and the angels are rejoicing.
Right.
But at the same time, we have to remember that's just the bare minimum. We want to strive for more.
Well, one of the chapters is titled "Resenting Chastity: The Current Crisis." What do you mean, resenting chastity?
It's the point John Paul II makes, is that in our culture today. And he's writing, by the way, 1950s Poland. I think this is even more so today. That many people not only many people in our world don't just think chastity is unnecessary. They actually work to fight against the virtue of chastity in the public arena. That they'll do things to try to say how chastity is actually something bad for humanity. That chastity is unnatural, it inhibits love. Because if two people love each other, they should be able to express it. And you Christians going around promoting chastity, you're really hurting love. You're hurting human persons.
Stifling expression and
exactly. And I think what the point John Paul II is saying there is that there's a certain sense of guilt that we have. When you see somebody, if somebody is not living faith, and they see someone living a strong Catholic faith, they're going to be they're going to tend to persecute that person. It's the point Ratzinger made in his famous Dictatorship of Relativism speech, where he talked about how anyone that has a strong conviction of faith is going to be labeled a fundamentalist today. So that's not someone that's doing that, tearing down those with faith and saying they're fundamentalist. They're not just men and women without faith. They're men and women that resent faith because it's like a mirror to their lives. and they see the standard and they're not living it. And that's what John Paul II is saying about chastity. When there's people that are holding chastity as a high standard, living by it, they don't like that. So they're going to shoot it down. And they're going to say chastity is a bad thing.
Well, it makes them feel guilty.
Exactly. Yep.
Let me just ask you, just before we go on our closing moments, this other book, just A Biblical Walk Through the Mass, Understanding What We Say and Do in the Liturgy. Just give me a quick thumbnail on this.
I'm so excited about this book. This is going through all of the parts of the Mass, everything we say and do, the rituals, the words, the hymns, and looking at their biblical roots. And we'll see that every little detail of the Mass comes from Scripture. The more we understand that, the more that we can give ourselves to Jesus and encounter Him in the liturgy. So what does it mean when we say, the Lord be with you, or holy, 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 glory to God in the highest, lift up our hearts? All these words we're so familiar with have biblical meaning, and I go through line by line through the Mass and try to explain that. And the fun thing about this book is it incorporates the new translation of the Mass, which really, I think, is a great opportunity for us as Catholics to understand the liturgy anew.
Sounds great. Thank you so much for all you do, Ted.
Oh,
Always good to see you. Good
Thanks
luck
so
with
much.
your series and both of your books. Okay, thank you. Talking here with Dr. Edward Shree, author of Men, Women, and the Mystery of Love, Practical Insights from John Paul II's Love and Responsibility. He's also got another book just out on the Mass, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. I'm Doug Keck. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.